Thank you so much, everyone, for watching today. I'm really excited because I have one of our successful students sitting in to talk to me a little bit today and to tell you a little bit about her journey. So, Shaughnele, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. So, what are you working on right now before you move on to med school?
So I'm not specifically finishing up a particular program right now. So a little bit about my backstory is my family and I are originally from South Africa, and we immigrated to a small rural community in northern British Columbia due to the political and economic uncertainty that was happening in South Africa. So I live on a small island below Alaska, and there's very limited resources. So from a young age, I went away to boarding school. I left home at 13, spent 5 years at boarding school, and then afterwards I went and completed my Bachelor of Science honors degree at Queen's University. So I went to the other side of Canada. I graduated in 2017, and then I decided to move back home to my little community. I was able to live home rent-free, and during these 2 years between when I graduated in 2017 and I started medical school, I spent 1 year studying and preparing for the MCAT exam, and then the subsequent year applying to medical school, because it is quite a process. So when you're applying to a lot of medical schools, it can sometimes feel like a full-time job. During this time, I was working a little bit. So I got the position as a replacement teacher on call within my community. So one of the things about living somewhere rural is they often struggle with the recruitment and retention of professionals, not only within the healthcare system, but within the teaching world as well. So I started teaching, working anywhere from kindergarten to grade 12, and then also some other miscellaneous jobs. I was cleaning cabins, working at a convenience store, serving ice cream, and then a little bit with the RCMP, just transcribing files for them. So now before I start medical school, I'm just winding down my summer. It's summer holidays, so school's ended. And my house is a little bit chaotic right now because I'm in the packing process because I leave on Friday, so it's coming up.
Wow. So just really quickly, what was that like, sort of being on the other side of the education process? You were working as a teacher for a little while. How did you find that experience?
It was actually really, really good. I never in a million years thought I would actually end up with a teaching position, and it was so beneficial actually to my MMIs because you get to learn a lot about the human behavior. And based on my rural community, there's a lot of people that are ethnic minorities. We have a very large First Nations population. I'll work with foster care students. I will work with kids that are from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So you learn a lot about real human behavior, like what it's like dealing with a student that's unmotivated to help themselves, and learning not to necessarily blame it as a disposition of their character, but maybe they're a product of their environment. And a lot of these things I was able to relate back to my MMI questions because I could relate it to how I think practice in medicine could be as well, dealing with different patient demographics. So yeah, it was really, really beneficial, but at the time I didn't know it.
That's all right. You know, it's so funny, just as someone who's been an educator for a long time myself, they say that you learn even more just by teaching. And I love your insight that counts for the subject matter, but it also counts for, like you said, just learning about human beings and their circumstances and just all of the things that we carry with us into the classroom, even as very young children or as adults going through education as well. So it's a real crash course in so many different kinds of learning, and it's such a beautiful thing when it works out that way.
Yeah. So it was really good.
Awesome. So was this your first time applying to med school?
No, definitely not. I've applied previous other years, but during those times I was still balancing school. I was balancing my extracurricular activities. I would do summer courses. So trying to write the MCAT in the summer was a little bit of a struggle when you're trying to also do summer courses elsewhere. And so this was the first year that I sat down and applied to a broad range of schools. Other previous years, it was kind of 1 or 2 schools at a time. But this was the first time that I sat down and was really, really strategic in my application process. I went and curated a huge list of schools, and I wrote everything down in an Excel spreadsheet. And I would write things like, what was their average GPA that they accepted? What was their average MCAT? What was the school's policy on international students? Were they having preferences for in-state versus out-of-state, or in-province versus out-of-province? So I cast a very broad net, but I like to think that it was strategic. And in the end, I ended up applying to over 20 medical schools this year. So it was quite a bit, but I've had friends that applied to a small handful of being successful and other friends that have applied to 30 plus schools. So it kind of depends on your schedule, I think, and what your work life is outside of school, because when you're doing 20 schools applications and you're getting those secondary applications in, and you should have 1 to 2 weeks to respond to those secondaries, it can become a very busy schedule very quickly. So yeah. But yeah, in total it was 20 or plus or minus a couple.
Sure. And it's like almost like a full-time job in and of itself, just completing all of those secondaries and all of the requirements. But good on you for your organization. I couldn't imagine trying to get through that without being so meticulous and organized. So that's a testament to your own just abilities to handle that massive amount of work. So where were you ultimately accepted, and which offer did you accept?
So for me, when I was applying to medical school, I kind of look at education as a stepping stone to where you want to go. So for me, ultimately, my end goal would be to complete residency in the United States and to practice medical school or practice medicine within the US. So I applied to schools that I felt would most lend me to that path or that opportunity. So I applied to medical schools in the Caribbean, Canada, and the US. I applied to the Caribbean because their curriculum is often geared towards helping students write and pass the USMLE, so the United States Medical Licensing Exam. Canada, even though they don't prepare students for the USMLE, the Canadian Medical Licensing Exam is considered equivalent to the USMLE, so students, once they're finished everything, can make that transition to the United States, and then obviously the US because you're within the system. So in total, I ended up getting 3 interviews. I got one at St. George's University, where I received a $50,000 scholarship to go there. I interviewed at UBC, so that's the University of British Columbia, Canada. So that's in Vancouver. And then I received one interview at Kansas City University of Medicine and Biosciences, where I ended up accepting their offer because it was the most direct path to my goal.
Nice. That's amazing. So, yeah, I mean, congratulations. Getting one acceptance is huge. Getting multiple and having a little bit of a decision in where you ultimately go is, it's just sort of above and beyond. And so I'm always glad to hear when students get that flexibility and you get to really look at what the curriculum is, how it suits your needs, the location, and the other benefits and things like that. So congratulations. That's wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Sure. So why did you decide to pursue medicine, and what was the sort of turning point or aha moment when you knew that this was what you were meant to do?
Oh, yeah, that's actually kind of a tough question because for me, I didn't have one set moment in time where I knew, wow, this is what I wanted to do. It was rather more cyclical, where I would have times in my life where I had this passion reaffirmed. So from the get-go, I was in a unique position where I had a lot of my family members in medicine. So my grandfather, he first specialized in obstetrics and gynecology, didn't end up liking it, so he re-specialized in radiology. My grandmother, she became the head of one of the big academic hospitals in South Africa, so she was a physician with a big leadership role. My other grandfather, he did veterinary science, and then my dad, he's an orthopedic surgeon. So from a very young age, I had that medical exposure in the household. So I got to see it from the home perspective. So I got to see what it was like to be on call. I would hear in the evenings when we were sitting having dinner, the politics behind medicine as well, and the pros and cons of these different areas. So that was my early exposure to medicine. And then as I grew up, I started, this triggered me to maybe consider science courses in high school. And then I really liked my science courses. And then with liking my science courses, when I had the opportunity to do volunteer activities, I would gear my volunteerism towards healthcare opportunities. So this is kind of how my life trajectory went with medicine. I would have moments where I would have that passion reaffirmed. Like, for example, one of my very first paid jobs was I was a dietary aide in the hospital kitchen. So I would serve food to patients in the ward and on the on-site geriatric facility. And my dad would often pull me aside and show me interesting cases before and after. And one of the things he does quite a bit is foot amputations for patients that are diabetic. So he would explain to me the physiology behind it of having poor foot neuropathy and everything that leads to these foot ulcers. But then he would also explain to me, and this is the part I found really, really interesting, is he would explain to me the social determinants of health. So being in a small rural community, we have people with low socioeconomic status. So they'll rely more heavily on fast food restaurants because it's cheaper. And now their diet is changed and now they have a higher susceptibility to diabetes. So for me, it would be moments like this where I saw medicine is really a holistic approach to healthcare, and there are so many different avenues, and that's what I really, really enjoyed. And I worked for a couple of years in different research laboratories. So I worked in a behavioral neuroscience lab, 2 years in a gender and sexuality laboratory, 3 years in a computational neuroimaging lab. So I got to see the regiments of the scientific method and how those come together. And then honestly, I would prefer completing observerships with physicians for free than I would going to my paid job. I had more fun in the hospital and being in this kind of community that I knew this is where I was happiest. So that's how it kind of worked for me for getting into medicine and deciding that that's what I wanted to do. But it was never one set moment, but rather cyclical.
That's such a beautiful story. I love so much about that. And, in particular, one thing I'm finding as I'm doing these interviews with students is, there is this sort of idea or myth that you're supposed to have that one determining moment that sets your course. And it really is, for some at least, a bit of a myth. And it is more of a gradual building process. And once you learn more about what it means to be someone in the healthcare system and all of the things that sort of contains outside of just the sort of stereotypical practice of medicine, when you realize your place in that huge community, that's usually what kind of steers people down that path and makes them want to stay within that community.
Yeah, for sure.
That's amazing. So you worked with BeMo on your interview prep. What was it like working on your interview prep with BeMo, and what, if anything, surprised you about the process?
Oh, I love working with BeMo. So there's so many different resources out there, and they can kind of become overwhelming. So what I did is I made a list of all the different resources what I was kind of looking for. So for me, I look at the MMI, or the multi-mini interview, as being really similar to public speaking. So when I was little, I used to do these public speaking competitions. And one of the things that we had to do after giving our big speech is there'd always be an impromptu session where they would give you a prompt or a quote of some sorts, and you would have only a couple of minutes to formulate your ideas, and then you'd have to present it in front of an audience. And that's really what I think the MMI stations are really similar to. You're very aware that you're speaking, you feel vulnerable, you feel nervous, you're aware that people are evaluating what you're saying and everything, your conduct, how professional you are you keeping eye contact? So I really think the MMIs are a skill set, and it's a skill set that you need to develop over a period of time. So the reason I really gravitated towards BeMo is because I was able to sign up for multiple MMI sessions. When I looked at other prep companies, a lot of the times you would pay and then you would get one interview session with them. And to me, this wasn't good enough. I needed to do multiple to be able to actually improve upon the skill. So I really loved working with BeMo. They were really easy to communicate with. Everything's laid out really eloquently. And what was great about BeMo is that you could schedule when you wanted to do your practice interviews. So for example, I would get an admissions offer saying, oh, you're invited to an interview at Kansas City University. Your interview is scheduled for 1 o'clock. So then what I would do with my BeMo sessions is I would schedule all my practice interviews for 1 o'clock so that I got to really simulate what the actual day would feel like. So I would practice in the morning. Okay, this is when I'm going to eat breakfast. This is when I'm going to drink a glass of water because this is when I'm going to need to go to the bathroom. I could really plan out my day. So that worked really, really well. And another thing I loved about BeMo is that you were getting practice interviews with so many other people. It wasn't one person that worked with you the entire time. So they didn't necessarily know your background story. So it was really indicative of what it was like for a stranger to evaluate you and then afterwards give you that constructive criticism. And then also the people that were evaluating you, they've seen so many students come through the BeMo process, so they know what answers sound cliche or are unique to your actual own life experience. And then a lot of these professionals have sat on their own admissions board. So whether it's a graduate program or a medical school or a dentistry school, they've actually sat and been part of the process for their school's institution to interview people. So they're not only comparing you to other BeMo students, they're comparing you to a whole cohort, which I thought was really great. And then also, I feel like I have so much to say. Also, they have these practice videos or these little video sessions that you can do when you're not actually doing the practice station live with a BeMo applicant or BeMo person. And I really love these videos. So for example, they would say, these are the hot topics that you need to know that could easily be asked in an MMI. And I would go through these topics and go, okay, say for example, it was the refugee crisis. I would then go watch a YouTube video on the refugee crisis from different perspectives and try to gear it towards how I think an MMI question could be asked. And I started to think like the application process. So I started in the evenings writing down what I saw in the news, what I think could be a proper MMI question from it. And from this, I was able to predict some of my actual interview MMI stations before ahead of time. So everything was so beneficial. I really enjoyed it. And it was something that I recommended to a lot of my friends as well. So I had a friend go through the BeMo process. He got accepted to his first choice physiotherapy school. So yeah, it was overall so supportive and I really loved it.
That's so wonderful. And I love so much about what you said. You are so incredibly meticulous and planned. That's incredible. But one of the things that I really value, and this is sort of interesting, you know, we do a lot with our students in the mock interviews and things like that. But one of the most important things that we do is give them homework, which is to say, you still need to work on this on your own. And here are some things that you need to keep doing, and emphasizing that it is a process and not something that can just be contained to 2-hour segments here and there. And so you really followed through on that and took what we gave you as a starting point for your own continued exploration. And that was so beneficial for you. And that's exactly what's required if you're going to get into and be successful in professional and graduate programs. You can't just stick with what you get in lecture or what you get in seminar. You have to go and use that as a jumping off point, not as the final point. And so there is this kind of symbiotic relationship between sort of student and consultant or mentor and mentee throughout this entire process that is itself indicative of what's going to be expected of you later. So that's just fantastic that you were able to take that initiative, make it your own, and that it was so beneficial for you in the actual MMI.
Yeah, and kind of going off what you said with the homework thing, that is so true as well. So for me, I learned very quickly what styles of questions I was very strong with and then ones that I was a little bit weaker with. So for me personally, I did well with the ethics types questions and the scenario-based questions, but I wanted to work a little bit more on the personal type questions. And BeMo recognized this and they were able to help me, and then they would give me homework as well saying, okay, these are the type of personal questions you should be able to answer really, really well. And then when you go to the next BeMo interview station, they'll ask you similar questions because we know this is what you're trying to work on and we really want you to practice this. So the homework thing was so true. And then I felt confident when I went into my actual interview that I have done everything in my power and anything now will be.
That's right. Yeah. And it's individualized, which I think is also so important. Like you said, being able to get feedback on those specific areas that you know you need to improve or that are identified as needing additional improvement. And we don't try to tell you what to say. We just try to find ways so that you can express your own narrative, your own story, your own perspective in a way that is as articulate and nuanced as possible. And so, yeah, it's great. You got from the process exactly what we hope students will get from the process. So that's beautiful, just beautiful.
Yeah, because I feel like one of the myths that are out there, and this was something that I was cautious of when I began, and this was actually something that some of the medical schools even said when you were invited for an interview, be cautious of this, is that prep companies will make everyone's answers all sound the same. Everyone's answers are going to sound rehearsed. And this was definitely not the case for me. It wasn't the case for my friends that use BeMo. They help you polish up your answers because they're not going to change your experiences. Your experiences are still your experiences. And so they just help you polish up those stories. And having a bit of a format is really, really beneficial because when you're actually doing your MMI, that minute and a half or the 2 minutes that you get to read the prompt before you enter the room, it goes by so quickly, especially when you're nervous. Because I remember when I was doing my MMI, the first prompt, half the time I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is my real medical school interview. And I almost wasn't even focused too much on the prompt because you're thinking those things. And so having a polished story to be able to fall back on, having a bit of a formula, it helps a lot, especially when you're nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's an inherently nerve-wracking situation. Even if you're as prepared and meticulous as you are, nerves are going to hit. And so, yeah, trying to give you something that you can fall back on and rely on while still articulating your own story, your own position is absolutely one of our goals. So that's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So we've heard a little bit about what you've learned from this whole process. If you had a piece of advice to offer other applicants, what would that be?
So my advice to other applicants, and this is easier said than done, and hindsight's always 2020, really do things on your own accord. Try not to follow and compare yourself to other students. And that's very hard to say when you're in the pre-med haze because no one really knows what they're doing. You're always constantly told, oh, there's no one-step formula to getting into medical school. You don't necessarily have to volunteer, or you don't necessarily have to do research. But it's no one really knows what they're doing. So you look to your peers to see, well, what are their strategies? And you try to maybe mimic that. And what I found is students, especially when they're pre-meds, they give advice, but they don't necessarily give the whole story. And I don't know if that's because they're scared that other people will then copy what they're doing and then maybe one up them. I don't really know. But so take what other students are saying with a grain of salt, because what I found is I asked other pre-med friends of mine, are you doing a prep course? They said no. Then once they got into medical school, when we were having conversations, they said, oh, I actually did a prep course. And it's like, but at the time you told me you didn't. So base whether you want to do a prep course or not on your own accord. Don't do it based on if other students are doing it or not, because a lot of the times they may not be telling the whole truth. So
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's incredibly competitive. And so it's, understandable in a sense that people wouldn't want to show their full hand, as it were. But at the same time, yeah, sometimes people leave things out intentionally. Well, and also even for students that get in, they can speculate on what it was that they think got them through the door, but they ultimately don't know what was going on in the reviewers' minds, in the interviewers' minds. And so this is one of the things that we tell students as well, is to sort of take what other people say with a bit of a grain of salt, unless they are on an admissions committee themselves or something like that. If you're just talking to other students, the whole process is so labyrinthine that you don't always know exactly what it was that got you in. And so even if you're giving the fullest advice from the best place possible, it still might be partial without you even realizing it. So I think that's an incredibly valuable lesson. So you're about to start this new journey. What are you most excited about?
I'm so excited to actually just be in, to be completely honest, to actually know that what I'm doing now, the steps that I'm making will be in 4 years' time, I will be a physician. And that's a pretty cool feeling to have. When you're in the pre-med undergrad phase, you're making steps and you are progressing forward, but you're not sure if what you're doing is going to necessarily lead to success, where now I have that feeling of, okay, if I study hard and I know I'm going to be writing these board exams and I'm going to do this, in the end, I'm still going to be a physician. Like, I'm going to get there. So it's having that security, and I don't have that fear of the unknown anymore, which is really exciting. And I'm excited to be part of such a unique program and to be part of a unique cohort of individuals, and to join a community where I'm looking forward to being in a tight-knit community. When I did my undergraduate degree, my major was in psychology. So it's one of those where it's a very big faculty. There were easily 1,000 students in my faculty, and you kind of feel like just a number. So I'm excited to start and be with other medical students and for us to become close with one another. And I'm also excited for us to be doing similar things. Like, when you're an undergrad, everyone's taking different courses. So even though you may all be doing a science major, someone may be doing biology and someone may be doing chemistry. Whereas here, we know we're all going to be taking the same anatomy class or the same pathology class. And I'm excited to be with that group. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think, having that feeling of a firm foundation under you finally is a great feeling. But, that sense of certainty, having that be balanced by a legitimate excitement for the process itself is so important. Sometimes we get so focused on that end goal that we forget to just soak it all in while we're in the midst of it. And yeah, in graduate and professional programs of all sorts, as you said, it's a much smaller cohort, and you quickly form these wonderful bonds with your fellow students and with your professors. There's a completely different relationship between professor and student at that level as well. And so to really feel like you're a genuine part of that academic community is something so many people want. And as you said, your experience is so common. Undergrads often just feel like a number, which is it's devastating to me as someone who's worked in higher education for so long. It's sad that we have to get to those higher echelons before you feel recognized as a human person, but it's a great feeling once you actually get to it. So what do you hope to accomplish ultimately as a practicing professional? We've talked about this a little bit, but where do you hope to see yourself 10 years from now?
So that's kind of a tricky one. I'm kind of more like, okay, just focus on the immediate, on the immediate. But I'm excited to get to that phase where you're really confident in what you're doing and you're able to build a nice rapport and have those interpersonal skills with patients and your colleagues at work. I'm really excited for that because one of the cool things that I got to do was when I did my observership, I would shadow physicians, but I would also shadow the medical students. And you get to see quite a big discrepancy, even though medical students are obviously very accomplished students, they work hard and they're now within this healthcare system, there's still a different level of competency. And so I'm excited for the whole trajectory, but it will be so nice once you get to that phase where you're a practicing physician, you have some experience under your belt, and you can have that nice rapport with patients where you feel comfortable to make these cheesy jokes with them. And, you know, when you're observing a physician, they make the same joke every time with a different patient. But to have that comfort level to make someone else feel comfortable when they're vulnerable, that's something I'm really excited for. And I think it just takes experience to be able to do that. Where I see myself in 10 years, I don't know at this point in time where or if I want to specialize or what I want to do. Being from a rural community, we don't have certain specialties and resources available. So I have had the opportunity to shadow pretty much mainly the primary care fields. But there's so much I feel like I don't even know necessarily exists out there. So I don't want to limit myself to one road just yet. So I'm excited to see what the different fields are, what they entail, and when you actually get that hands-on experience to feel what it actually feels like, because observing someone is very different than doing it yourself. So I don't know where or if I want to specialize at this point in time. 10 years from now, I would be finished medical school. I would either be just finishing residency or would have finished residency. Maybe I'll do a fellowship, depends on what I go into, and then start paying back my student loan.
We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the student loan.
So no. Yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah, that's such a great attitude. You know, so many people, well-intentioned, but unfortunately limit themselves going in thinking this is exactly what I'm going to do. I know exactly what I want to end up specializing in. I know exactly where I want this path to go. But like you said, you don't really know the reality of it until you're in it. And so many people have their mind set on one thing when they go in, and that just gets thrown completely out the window a few years later. And that's fine. But I think embracing it with this sort of completely open mind as to, you know, I accept that there are unknown unknowns, and I don't know where I'm going to end up until those unknown unknowns become at least known unknowns. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's what humans are sort of notorious for thinking that we have certainty when actually we just don't because of that that lack of understanding of just how much there is to be understood. And part of the education process is making those once hidden things at least accessible or noticeable. It's such a dramatic change in how education takes place. I often tell students the difference between undergrad and graduate and professional programs is as substantial as the difference from going from high school to undergrad, because of just the ways that knowledge and specializations open up to you in ways that you just didn't even know exist. So good on you for having such an open perspective and an openness to the process. I think that's so important.
Yeah, no, because there's so many different factors to consider. And I also think it depends on where you're going to live too, and the lifestyle that you want to have. Like, for example, being in a rural community, a lot of, especially family care physicians, take on a huge breadth of patients and have to cover a huge breadth of areas and domains because we don't have certain specialties. So they do a little bit of everything, whereas maybe in an urban center, that may not be the case. Whereas when I shadowed the pediatrician here, she was saying, okay, when she used to practice in this community, this is what pediatrics was like. But when you're in a rural community, because we don't have a psychiatrist or a psychologist, she gets a lot of behavioral problems. So it also depends on where you live, patient demographic, what kind of lifestyle you want to get out of it. And so I just want to be open to the different options and experiment a little bit and see where that takes me.
Mhm. Well, and I love that just your own lived experience by being in a rural community gives you that ability to step back and realize just how many different determinants there are in terms of where your education takes you, where your practice takes you, along with, all of the factors that patients would bring with them into your practice on a daily basis. So that's fantastic. You're really able to take that life experience and allow it to shape your perspective, which is that's something that you can't train for, really. You can't take a prep
Yeah,
course for that. So that's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear it.
thank
All
you.
right. Well, that's it on my end. Any final words or anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think that's kind of everything from my perspective. This has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this. It's kind of cool to stand from this side and be able to give back information, because I'm someone that would really watch a lot of YouTube videos and try to get the advice of students that have gone through these real experiences, because to me, this is so much more than just the statistics. All the schools publish their stats, so you know what the average stats are about, but to actually hear someone share their real insight and their personal stories makes a big change.
And
So.
I'm so glad to hear that. And yeah, that's what this whole project is about, is letting people share their stories, because they're so much more diverse than the numbers make them seem. And so getting students or aspiring med students or professional students to be able to see the actual journeys that people have taken and not just dry quantitative data, as important as that might be, I think is just so important in terms of inspiration, motivation, and just figuring that path out for themselves. So thank you again for participating in this.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening or watching, and stay tuned for the next interview.